And once again, if you're just arriving to the Spring Public Lecture Series, our first lecture at the Fay Jones School this spring, we will begin more fully at 5 minutes past the hour. Thanks very much for your patience. And as our audience builds beyond 240, we will take another minute to make sure that every seat, every conceptual seat in the conceptual room is filled. And thanks for your patience as we just make sure we can start with as many people participating as possible. Well, very good. I now have 5 minutes past 4 here Central Standard Time in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And so good afternoon as the afternoon trains wind their way through the city. You may hear those whistles in the background. My name is Peter McKeith. I'm the Dean of the Fay Jones School of Architecture and Design at the University of Arkansas. And it's my pleasure and my privilege to welcome all of you, all our students, our faculty, our staff, members of our larger community, our alumni, really across the country and the world, as well as friends and guests from the greater region, and really also from across the world, to this first lecture in the Spring 2021 Public Lecture Series of the school. In just a few minutes, we will have members of our faculty to provide a further introduction to the fullness of the lecture series that lies ahead, and also more specific introductions to our guests lecturing this evening. But as we start, I want to thank in particular our friends at Places Online Journal. Really, I would say the world's finest online journal in architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism, for their co-sponsorship, as well as, or closer to home, our colleagues at the University of Arkansas Office for Diversity and Inclusion for their partnership with us in this overall series effort. These lectures, both in the fall and this spring, are also made possible through a generous gift to the school by Ken and Liz Allen, citizens of Fayetteville, who have assisted us in this lecture series in the cause of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're very grateful to Ken and Liz Allen for their support in this endeavor and in many others that they help us with at the school. It is, of course, important to welcome you to campus. And this is the image that you have in front of us, is an image looking southward across the towers of Old Main, across the territory of the hilltop towards downtown Fayetteville and towards the Boston Mountains. But as we welcome you to campus and welcome our guests to campus, it's also essential that we welcome you acknowledging the peoples that existed, occupied, inhabited this land well before us, and recognize their accomplishments, their achievements, and their presence among us in spirit and in fact. And with that, I'd like to provide us all with the land acknowledgement statement that we now use in beginning each of our public events. The indigenous history of the land the University of Arkansas campus sits on goes back to time immemorial. And across that expanse of time, many successive groups have lived here and created sacred legacies in this area. The Faye Jones School of Architecture and Design acknowledges indigenous peoples were forced to leave their ancestral lands, including the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw nations with ties to Northwest Arkansas. We further recognize that a portion of the Trail of Tears runs through our campus, and that the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee or Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations passed through what is now Arkansas during this forced removal. We acknowledge all indigenous teachers, researchers, and all other residents in our community and region today. We seek continuity and connection to the past as we look to the future with increased collaboration with indigenous governments and entities. We say to the citizens of indigenous nations, we see you and we thank you. Now with that, I'd like to pass to our lecture series in general. And in doing so, I'd like to recognize Assistant Professor Brian Holland for his efforts in organizing our lecture series. And equally, I'd like to recognize Associate Professor Gabriella Diaz Montemayor and Michelle Pribernow, our Director of Career Development, for their leadership overall in the school's Committee for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Without these contributions by our faculty and staff, we would not be able to bring such a fine series forward and be able to present these issues to you in such vital ways. Brian, if you could please introduce us to the lecture series, and then Gabrielle will introduce us to this evening's lecturers. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Dean McKeith. Hi, everyone. As Peter said, my name is Brian Holland, and I'm an assistant professor of architecture here at the Faye Jones School. I coordinate the school's public lecture series, which has once again gone virtual due to the pandemic. Building on the momentum of the fall series, we have a rich array of events lined up for you, including 6 lectures, a symposium, and 2 workshops. These programs will again help us interrogate the roles that design students, educators, and professionals can play in shaping the spaces, structures, and landscapes of a more equitable and just future. In a time of great collective urgency, what projects, histories, and ideas have shaped the built environment as we now know it? And what concepts, critiques, and practices must we consider in our own determined efforts to improve it? So we begin the series with tonight's lecture by Natalie Frankowski and Cruz Garcia of WAI Architecture Think Tank, for whom Associate Professor Gabriella Diaz Montemayor will provide a fuller introduction in just a moment. Thank you to Gabrielle for organizing this first event of the series. 3 weeks later, on February 15th, we will again gather in Zoom for a presentation by the Mexico City-based architect Tatiana Bilbao, whose exhibition, Two Sides of the Border, is currently on view here in our first floor gallery space. Then on Monday, March 1st, we will host designer, creative technologist, and critical maker Benaz Farahi for a lecture about her work, which uses emerging technologies to transform the relationship between the body and space. On March 8th, we will host a lecture by this year's John G. Williams Distinguished Visiting Professors, Teddy Cruz and Fauna Foreman, whose work is deeply rooted in the trans-border communities of San Diego, California, and Tijuana, Mexico. Then on 2 consecutive Mondays, we will host Piggybacking Practices, a symposium on architecture and inequality. This online symposium and exhibition will explore the work of architects and designers who, in an era of increasing social and economic inequality, are developing innovative multiple use tactics as a means of anchoring socially or economically marginal activities alongside dominant ones. Symposium participants will include Georgine Theodore of Interboro, Dana Cuff of City Lab, Jaffer Kolb, and Evie Diamantopoulos of New Affiliates, and many more. Then on March 29th, we will host Mia Lehrer for a lecture on her advocacy work in design and planning. She's the founder and director of the LA-based practice Studio MLA that integrates landscape architecture, urban design, and planning. And finally, on April 5th, Pascal Sablon, founder of Beyond the Built Environment and the creator of the Say It Loud exhibition series, will deliver the final lecture of our series, discussing her efforts at highlighting the work done by women architects and architects of color. So again, in addition to thanking once again Places Journal and the University of Arkansas Office for Diversity and Inclusion for their partnership in presenting this series, I also want to thank my faculty colleagues for their valuable contributions to the shaping of this series and these events. Thanks especially to Dean McKeith for his vision and support of this series. So thank you all for joining us today on behalf of the school, Places Journal, and the Office for Diversity and Inclusion. We look forward to seeing you again for each of these upcoming lectures. Now I'd like to turn it over briefly to Byron McEwen for a description of some of the technical tips for tonight's event.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Brian. Just a few updates. Be sure you utilize the Q&A function. This is a webinar. The Q&A allows us to better keep track of your questions. However, given this particular talk, we may be dealing with some concepts that come to your heart faster than your head. So if your question seems too much for typing, just raise your hand and we'll see if we can't get you some mic time towards the end. For those of you attending for continuing education credits, please pay attention after the webinar is over. You'll receive a survey and a pop-up in your browser, and I'll need your AIA or ASLA member number in order to get credit. Just a reminder, this doesn't apply to students, so you don't need to submit your student ID number. The lectures are all recorded. They will be made available first to students and faculty because they are hosted on internal servers, but once we are able to move them and get the right permissions, we will be sharing them more broadly. Hope you all enjoy. Thanks.
Thanks, Byron. Now I'd like to turn it over to Gabriella Diaz Montemayor for an introduction to tonight's speakers. Gabriella.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to do a quick introduction of our guests this afternoon. I'll try not to spend much time so that we focus on their lecture. But this is a very exciting lecture for all of us, of course, in the school, but in particular, exciting for us as well at the diversity initiative of the school. And it's part of the context that Dean McKeith, of course, also described at the beginning of today's lecture. I'll go quickly through WAI's biography. WAI, as in What About It, architecture think tank, is a planetary studio practice that questions the political, historical, and material legacy and imperatives of architecture and urbanism. Planetary is certainly not a common way to describe a practice, but in their case, it is uniquely appropriate. As we were preparing for this event and preparing advertisements for this event, we had to track where WAI came from. Is it Beijing, Puerto Rico, Belgium? In my case, personally, I had the luck to enjoy a lecture and interview with Natalie and Cruz in the Mexican architecture and design magazine Arquine, only to realize that they had also just been recently doing a workshop at my alma mater in Mexico. A quick look in their website illustrates a traveling practice, lecturing and disseminating their timely and critical work at a global scale. In just a few days, WAI will lecture at SciArc. Before this, our event with WAI, they lectured at the Anti-Racist School of Architecture Symposium. They opened an installation in Venice, Italy in December. They were featured in the New York Review of Architecture. They lectured in Johannesburg, South Africa, and the list goes on. WAI was founded in Brussels, Belgium, during the financial crisis of 2008 by Puerto Rican architect, artist, curator, educator, author, and theorist Cruz Garcia, and French architect, artist, curator, educator, author, and poet Natalie Frankowski. WAI is one of their several platforms of public engagement that include Beijing-based anti-profit art space Intelligentsia Gallery, and the free and alternative education platform and trade school Loud Readers, which I'm sure they are going to speak about later today. Garcia and Frankowski are assistant professors at Virginia Polytechnic and State University, Virginia Tech, and visiting lecturers at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. They are former Ann Calla professors at Carnegie Mellon University, high chairs of excellence in architecture at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and visiting teaching fellows at the School of Architecture at Taliesin. Their work has been published in multiple journals, venues, has been exhibited also in multiple locations and places. I would just like to emphasize among their publications the recently published Manual of Anti-Racist Architectural Education, which it's one of the publications that has been disseminated widely since Natalie and Cruz published it. And finally, just to make a comment on their emphasis also on this transformation of design education. Both of them, WAI, invest significant efforts on workshops for architecture and urbanism that speculate on the possibility of anti-racist imageries, anti-ableist imageries, anti-capitalist imageries, anti-alienating imageries, anti-imperialist imageries, and anti-heteropatriarchal imageries. Speaking of workshops, we are very happy and lucky to have Natalie and Cruz deliver a couple of workshops for our school. I'm going to paste here in the chat box a description of quick description of the workshop, so I don't take more time from them. And it will describe as well the procedure that we are going to implement for the selection of the students that are going to be admitted into the workshop. I'll paste that right now. And with that, please join me on virtually welcoming Natalie and Cruz. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the introduction, Gabriella, and thank you very much, everybody, for inviting us. We are super thrilled to be here with you virtually. And we're also looking forward to the workshops the upcoming 2 weeks. Hopefully we have some great works and interesting discussions and urgent discussions. To start the lecture, we're really happy that we heard about the land acknowledgement of the University of Arkansas, which we also had to say that it is not only the people of the nations that were replaced in the site where you are right now, but that the Memorial Grant, the Memorial Act of 1872 was part of Manifest Destiny, right? So as you can see in the map from landgrab.org or .com, you can see all the many other indigenous lands that were dispossessed in order to generate the wealth that makes the value of the campus, right? And that start building the endowment and makes all these institutions of public education possible. This will also allow us to establish a relationship to what has been happening around us, right? So, sadly, we have plenty of evidence to see how this history of settler colonialism and land occupation is displayed in every channel around us, right? From the institutions that are supposed to protect us and educate us, to the ones that are supposed to be making the laws that allow us to live a dignified life. When you see here the Sioux shaman with all the sort of reappropriation of indigenous sort of customs, sort of distortion of it, and somebody walking with a Confederate flag that never made it during the Civil War in a space that was built by Black enslaved labor. It is not so out of context, right? There is a historical narrative here to be explored, and something that we wish to go in depth as we question the current situation. Just as we speak, we come from a 39-hour travel trying to get from Europe to the US in the age of COVID. Is not easy, but it's much easier than to see in the legacy also of this necropolitics, right? The politics of deciding who lives and who dies understanding what's the scale. You know, this common grave in the left there is in Brazil. Understanding the relationship between the land and life, and understanding what is the role of architecture and urbanism in all of this, and understanding the relationship also between the first slide that we showed you with the events of January 6th in the capital, with all the white supremacists taking over and sort of questioning an election and demanding their white supremacist president to remain in power. The necropolitics of behind COVID-19, and the global struggle that Black Lives Matter puts into evidence. They're not disassociated events, but they're rather part of the same vehicle. And for today's lecture, we like to start with this quote that is really important for us, by a Cameroonian philosopher, Achille Mbembe, where he argues in his provisional notes on the postcolony that the postcolony is made up of a series of corporate institutions and a political machinery. Once they are in place, constitute a distinctive regime of violence that is characterized by a distinctive style of political improvisation, by a tendency to excess, and a lack of proportion, as well as by a distinctive way in which identities are multiplied, transformed, and put into circulation. Both building and departing from Mbembe's definition, we like to propose a different form of postcolonial understanding. The postcolonial use as a fabricated term that to describe fictional narratives that take the cruelty, the abuse, and the brutalism that was so evident in the plantations that now have become generalized everywhere around the world, right? And the three slides that you just saw, they put that into evidence. The title of the lecture is Loud Reading Postcolonial Landscapes, and we will go over each one of these terms in a flood of images that also relate to our work, relate to the ambition we have in the workshop we will be doing, but also to a possible imaginary of a postcolonial future that is critical, but also that is aware of all the latent threats of our times.
Part 1, Clinical Loud Reading from 1968 to 2008. The fully developed ability to say no is also the only valid background for yes. And only through both does real freedom begin to take form.
We finished school in 2008 during the financial crisis of Lehman Brothers. So right now it is quite easy for a lot of you, especially students or young professionals, to understand what does it mean to enter the discipline or the adult life during a time of crisis, right? It also allows us to establish some parallels about the populism that we just witnessed in that first image of January 6th with things that have been happening around us, right? It's not a coincidence that Charlottesville in Virginia was part of the same narrative, right? And also understanding that people like Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro are not new to this, right? When I arrived to Europe in 2008, Geert Wilders have just released in the Netherlands Fitna, an extremely Islamophobic propaganda film, and France had Marine Le Pen, the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, extreme right-wing politicians, and we see it in Greece and Italy and so on. It is up to us also to figure out the relationship of architecture to this. And not architecture as an abstract, right? But architecture as something practiced by architects. In this case, Mark Zuckerberg, the lord of our information online, working with Frank Gehry, or the author of the neoliberal manifesto, Jesse Moore, B.R. Kingles, working with Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, known an outspoken racist that, as you can see in some of the quotes, where he's saying that it's a shame that the Brazilian cavalry hasn't been as efficient as the Americans who exterminated the Indians, right? Or claiming that all these Indians are staying in land that will generate value to him, right? When we as architects don't have a spine, and we will work with whoever, even if that implies the destruction of people and the environment, right? Understanding also, as this estimate says, that even if indigenous communities around the world make up only 4 to 5% of the world's population, they protect over 85% of the planet's biodiversity, right? So when we're working with people that are completely against and killing indigenous communities, we are contributing to this system of settler colonialism. And on this note, seeing the architectural media with a complete lack of criticality promoting projects like from the people that brought us chattel slavery and settler colonialism, proposing applying to redesign Earth to stop climate change, right? And on top of that, call it master planet, right? Like this is, I will cry if it's not because it makes me laugh the ridiculousness of the hubris of some architects, right? And understanding the relationship of settler colonialism to the media and to the technology that surrounds us, not only as an ancient history, but as somebody like Elon Musk, when he got questioned what wasn't in the best people interest by organizing a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia, to which he replied, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it," right? So the face of settler colonialism is not really something that they keep hidden away from us, right? It is pretty out there, right? And even if you said this with a hint of humor, it is a quite serious issue. This is a psychogeographical map of our first 12 years of practice. And these are all the places that we were kind of forced to move or that we have been circulating, from Puerto Rico, where I'm from, to France, where Natalie's from, to Belgium, where we met, to China, where we lived for 7 years from 2009 until 2016, in which we could witness the forces of modernity happening before us. We always studied the idea of modernity as something that happened in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, but living in China from 2009 really witnessed that sort of changes. We moved from a city of 20 million people in Beijing, where we lived, to waking up the next day in the middle of the fields of the rolling hills in Wisconsin, in the former home of Frank Lloyd Wright. The sort of, if we're gonna put a face to the idea of the male genius American architect, of course, this is the one that comes to mind first in many people's imaginary, right? So not only understanding this completely different environment, kind of devoid of people mostly, that was quite striking to me personally, and to us as a collective, but also having to engage with a history of of whitewashing and of fabricating the idea of the architect as the singular male individual genius, right? A space in which none of us would have been able to participate, right? As you can see in this picture with the older Frank Lloyd Wright surrounded by a bunch of younger white men. How can we reclaim a space for a new model or a different model of education that engages with architecture from a critical standpoint, right? So that was part of our premise by becoming visiting teaching fellows at the School of Architecture at Taliesin, engaging with high schoolers from Arizona, and even with our students questioning the legacy of the shelters that were being built there, right? Like the idea that we're questioning the romanticism behind the materials, or even the questions that we're asking about the buildings that we're building, right? And this documentary that we're a part of the BBC in the UK, that has this really extremely problematic title, right? Frank Lloyd Wright, the man who built America, right? Not only that America is not a country, right, but a continent or a group of continents, and the fact that a single man can be the man that built this country, right? Completely ignoring the idea of collaboration, solidarity, and even authorship. Some of the story, even an institution with problems becomes also threatened by neoliberal capitalism. Understanding for us, finishing school in 2008, during a crisis, understanding the parallels with history, how history seems not necessarily to repeat itself, but not really end at all, right? Like the questions, as you can see here with the Stonewall in New York for gay rights, or the civil rights movement, or the student protest in Paris, the protest in Paris in May '68, or the Prague Spring in the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia back then, or even the images of Baltimore in '68. They're not very different to what we're living today, right? Understanding that we are still protesting for the same things, right? That not much has changed, right? For that idea that we live in a post-racial, fair society that somehow neoliberal capitalism made some people believe at some point, right? By looking inside their bubble, that bubble has been burst. So seeing all these images, it's not something that looks different to today. Like maybe 10 years ago, people will question, like, this passé, there's no great narratives, no great questions, and so on. But all this has been exposed as being a lie, right? As being, we are constantly reminded that the struggles that we were fighting for 50 years ago are the same struggles we are still fighting now. Understanding that the icons that serve a central role are still the same people that we're looking at for modeling our abolitionist imaginary, like Angela Davis. Understanding the privilege that we have today, where I can lecture through this computer screen and not behind a bulletproof screen, right? Understanding how crazy it is that Angela Davis had to put bulletproof to be able to do a lecture where somebody doesn't take her life away, right? Understanding where are our icons and what happened to them, right? When they try to use the power of image to express their questioning of the systems in power, right? The punishment that they had to go through. Understanding what is the relationship of land occupation and the people that have been suppressed and oppressed. Understanding what's the role of settler colonialism, not 500 years ago, but still today. That the regimes of anti-Blackness are not only local and particular of the United States, but part of a machinery, a global machinery that will see the assassination of people like Patrice Lumumba, that will see apartheid running in South Africa, that will see the assassination of Fred Hampton, just at 21 years old. The death of Malcolm X. Patrice Lumumba, the first president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the first democratically elected prime minister, assassinated 2 years younger than me. He was assassinated by the American government together with the government of Belgium. Understanding what happens once we think that the problems of labor and extraction are not happening just because they're not happening before our own eyes, right? What happens with a system of exploitation and extraction that pushes far away the suffering, right, and the destruction of the earth, right, in a planet that is shared by all of us. This is an image of the rare earth extraction mines in Inner Mongolia in China. Understanding what happens with all the people that are behind all of our projects, right? These are a protest by the Gilets Noirs in the Pantheon in Paris. A lot of sub-Saharan African workers that have been denied of a dignified access to life. Understanding the history of the colony, right? And in this case is where the postcolonial imaginary comes into play. I come from the oldest colony in the world. Puerto Rico was invaded in November 1493, and has been a colony ever since, right? 400 years a colony of Spain, 123 years a colony of the United States. Understanding during our only successful sort of displacement of a leading politician in the summer of 2019, where Bad Bunny, our reggaeton or Latin trap singer, was already forecasting what was going to happen 6 months later when he was wearing a face shield and a mask. And this beautiful poem by our Puerto Rican trans poet, Raquel Salas Rivera, that I feel describes perfectly the idea of necropolitics today. With in one side of the image, 4,645 deaths of Puerto Ricans after Hurricane Maria, right? Really similar to what happens in COVID, where the authorities don't care about life. And this beautiful poem that says, "Hey gringo, if you love death so much, why don't you marry it?" Understanding what are the manifestos that are the great narratives that we're looking at. This is the leading icons of the protests in Puerto Rico are the Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, the feminist collective in construction, and this T-shirt that is one of the most powerful manifestos I can think of, where that it reads, "Anti-patriarchal, feminist, lesbian, trans, Caribbean, Latin American," understanding who is leading the struggles, right? On the left side, Ricky Martin with the rainbow flag during the Puerto Rican protests, and in the right side, witnessing in Pittsburgh in the summer of 2020 during the Black Lives Matter protests, how I see a group of young Black queer high schoolers led the city protests for more than 12 consecutive weekends, right? Like really putting their life in the front line against the police violence against Black people. Understanding what is the role of architecture, what is the role of public space, what is the role of urbanism in all of this, right? In a place where the land was violently expropriated, built by enslaved Black labor, Black people don't have a right to protest in public spaces, right? So whose public is it? Who is allowed to occupy those spaces? And what choices do we have, right? Where do we stand as architects, right? Understanding that this, again, is not only particular to the US, but where do we stand when the protests in Chile or in Baltimore, in Minneapolis, or in Puerto Rico makes us ask the question if a building is more valuable than Black life, right? Where do we stand when we feel more insulted by somebody breaking a glass window of a bank than when somebody gets choked to death by the police in front of a camera? Understanding what are the limits of the institutions that are supposed to protect us, right? Institutions that, if we track their history, come from the legacy of slavery. Understanding where do we stand in the construction of the devices and the apparatuses that oppress and destroy us, right? And this is a print screen we took from HOK, where they're saying in a very Orwellian language that they design detention and correctional centers that facilitate the humane treatment and rehabilitation of inmates while ensuring the safety and satisfaction of each staff member. This in a country that exorbitantly incarcerates Black and brown communities, right? Black and brown people. So for an architect to think that he's designing dignifying prisons is basically a big lie. Understanding what are the architectures that we're generating, right? If we look at the where the institutions are lying and in their participation or in the lack of decrying the institutions that are not only separating us but destroying the environment, right? What is the relationship between what we do and what we destroy in the way to do that? Understanding who's fighting the fight, right? All the indigenous communities that have been putting their life to protect resources that are for all of us, right? And a question that Achille Bembe asked is, who owns the earth and what do we do with those who don't have a stake on it, right? Understanding that it's not a matter of if these pipes are gonna break and contaminate our water, but when are they gonna break, right? And who's gonna be affected by it? Understanding what is the most democratic form of architecture, right? And we may have been witnessing it all along as communities all around the world have been democratically joining to bring down racist monuments that were undemocratically erected, right? Understanding the beauty in an act of solidarity and collectivity, right? Understanding that Black Lives Matter somehow is an architectural movement that denounces the construction of incarcerating and policing infrastructures and ask for the possibility of other worlds.
Part 2, Postcolonial Loud Readers, 1920-2020. The only purpose of education is to make new worlds collectively. This requires the practice of curiosity as a daily habit and the exercise of dignified and purposeful rebelliousness. Other worlds are possible.
We usually ask a question if you can see a difference between the left and the right picture, and somebody will say in the left picture there's no women, right? And this is the legacy of the Bauhaus, right? Where Walter Gropius taught that women couldn't think in 3 dimensions, therefore they couldn't do architecture or sculpture or none of the disciplines that they thought valuable, right? So they created interiors and textiles and ceramics and photography for more domestic sort of approach to design, right? And that's where the women were kind of forced to enroll. Why do we keep on learning so much about the Bauhaus without questioning, when at the same time, or even a year before, in the small Jewish town of Vitebsk in Belarus, the painter Marc Chagall founded the People's Art School, as you can see here, with children and women and men, where not only were women allowed to collaborate in everything, where one of the first collectives was founded, but women were also administering the school. So it was, in 1919, Vera Molayeva was running the People's Art School in Vitebsk. She invited Kazimir Melievich, who joined the faculty where Lisitsky was teaching, and they co-founded what some people call the first art collective in the history of modern art and design, where, as you can see, men and women were producing works together and signing it as a collective. This collective called Unobis, that name translates into champions of new art or affirmers of new art. And understanding why, even before this, we don't learn about a practice of solidarity performed in the tobacco factories in the Caribbean, started in Cuba and eventually moved to Puerto Rico, in which workers who were denied any means of formal education will choose one among themselves who knew how to read aloud for them during the entire workday. The readings that these lectores would read, or loud readers would read, were initially classics like Victor Hugo, and eventually will move into political domain. They will read Kropotkin, Bakunin, Marx, and Engels, and they will realize that they have ways to unionize and to make syndicates and ask for better rights. Among these loud readers, we can find Luisa Capetillo, a Puerto Rican author, loud reader, and feminist that was arrested several times for wearing pants in public, and Juana Colón, the daughter of former slaves. And they will generate some of the largest strikes of 10, 15,000 workers, and demanding better rights, right? Not only for workers, but for people that didn't even have access to jobs. This, of course, became an empowering tool for the workforce, which the government and the factories hated, the owners of the factories, so they made the practice illegal, right? So they persecuted the workers, arrested them, and killed them. This allows us also to reformat who are the thinkers we are thinking about, who are the thinkers we are referencing, and where is the knowledge coming from? What happens when the Eurocentric sort of canon of knowledge it gets replaced by other forms of knowledge, right? In the case of Frantz Fanon, or Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui in Bolivia, or Sayak Valencia in Tijuana, or Achille Bembe in South Africa, or Angela Davis here in the United States. Understanding, again, the role that we have as academics or scholars or designers to question these silly points, right? Like the visionary founder of the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, was so great, and so on and so forth, and trying to think in other dimensions, right? This is a diagram that Stefan Truby created in his study of right-wing spaces, where he divides between the progressive left and the and the sort of right-wing anti-globalist left, the anti-globalist left and the patriotic nationalist anti-Semitic right and the right-wing capitalist right, where we can find Patrick Schumacher, and understanding what happens when we start thinking of architecture in those terms, right? With this quote by the chair of the architecture department in Harvard right now, where he says that he sees the GSD as the most Eurocentric school in America, and that's something that should be preserved and expanded, but they should consider other bridges to Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia. Of course, he forgot Africa. Or kind of the empty slogans like Monica Ponce de Leon that said that data drives diversity, right? That understanding that data is actually used to oppress, right? How the police in Pittsburgh use the predictive policing software algorithms that Carnegie Mellon produced in order to keep on oppressing Black and brown communities and gentrify the land, right? Or understanding what happens, you know, when the algorithms are working against us, right? Like the algorithms in this case, because nobody wanted to take the blame, as they edited Justin Garrett Moore out of his presentation in the affordable housing design. So somehow Architect Magazine had to apologize that they made a mistake by leaving out. So you can see they left the shadow of the only Black speaker in the presentation. That's the only thing he could see of himself. Somebody went to the trouble, let's say an algorithm, we assumed that it was a person, went to the trouble to edit him out, right? Understanding how the systems are so in place that even people that one would consider over-accomplished won't even dare, right, to stay in these institutions sometimes, right? As we can see in the case of Leslie Loco leaving the City University of New York Architecture School. And understanding other systems of oppression, right? That are sometimes missing of our narratives. The history of redlining that is really present, and hopefully we can discuss more about Arkansas once we are in the workshops, and understanding how these tools, for the people that think that architecture and politics have nothing to do, just look at the releases by the press releases by the White House, right? With the executive orders, how to promote beautiful civic architecture, right? The concept of beauty that is so that we use it, take it for granted, that has been used by fascists as a tool of ethnic cleansing for so long, right? Like for that is not beautiful, is not human, and doesn't belong to the narratives of the grandeur of people that want to generate a sort of a homogeneous society, right? Understanding that sort of that the anti-Black racism doesn't happen only when you're trying to lynch somebody, right? But also happens by invisibility and by displacement, right? In this case, two projects that will be about Blackness, but that avoid talking about it, or in one case instrumentalizes children to play with weapons in a space that if those children are with those same weapons, toy weapons, without the white audience, they will probably get shot by the police, right? Or seeing all these monuments being built, never for Black slaves, right? For enslaved laborers, where they avoid to talk about the idea of Blackness as the sort of underlying condition, that are usually given to non-Black designers, right? So Blackness only exists when we're talking about suffering and oppression, but never when it's time to find a designer to design a monument for it, right? Understanding what type of right-wing works exist. This is from my colleague in Virginia Tech that published this book, Non-Referential Architecture, when he says that non-referential architecture has nothing to do with dystopias or being woke or critical theory or utopia, but rather with the single sort of genius architect to solve the world through form, right? And understanding how problematic these narratives are. And understanding when right-wing spaces are not just gas chambers and detention centers, but when architectural school is the very right-wing space, right? This picture of Walter Gropius in Harvard shows, you know, something that is quite problematic, right? Just a bunch of white men taking decisions over everything, right? So this is not very different than many architectural studios around the world, right? This image that we see here. And understanding what happens when we translate those images of the Bauhaus, right? That look so beautiful and that have been repeated so so long in our imaginary, where they divide everything by discipline, by materials. When we make a translation of who was allowed in or not, it is basically men at the center and in the top, and women displaced to the bottom disciplines, to the disciplines that have less value. And against this, we propose, instead of a closed system, as part of our study in the Manual of Anti-Racist Education, a spiral that has anti-racism in the middle, where every single form of knowledge, from media to theory, history, and form, has to be intersected with these anti-racist, anti-ableist, transfeminist, anti-capitalist, ecologically just questions, right? So this is part of this Manual of Anti-Racist Architecture Education that you should be able to download it for free from our webpage, and that we are about to publish in Spanish soon. We finished the translation, and now that we work with Carolina Julio from Colombia, she helped us to translate it, and now it's about to be published completely in Spanish, with some parts more dedicated to Latin America. That comes from this diagram from where Alfred Barr talk about the history of Cubism and abstract art, while overlooking completely the history of colonization, as Hank Willis Thomas shows here. And taking those diagrams by Charles Jenks that we have seen in our theory classes, right? Completely uncritical diagrams that completely overlook political movements, and showing how, as we can see in this map, in this chronocartographic map, anti-Black regimes like Jim Crow, apartheid, and white Australia policy have been present around the world for more than 100 years in the last 120 years, right? Understanding what is the role of people like Philip Johnson, that went to a Nazi Hitler-Junts rally at the same year that he founded the design and architecture departments in MoMA, in the Museum of Modern Art. Understanding the relationship of endowments and tuition fees and the GDP of some countries, right? In order to highlight the impossibility of many people to study in the universities that we found prestigious or important, right? How that idea of elitism is deeply embedded in the very same institutions that should be creating new worlds. This is part of all of the diagram. You will see the numbers that are obscene and disgusting. Like, for example, Columbia University, total cost between tuition and living will be $100,000, while a Black family in Manhattan, the median household income is only $28,000, right? And showing how white students are 40% more likely to win private scholarships than anybody else, right? So it is, even the scholarships are tilted towards some form of inequality. Understanding who has built these universities, right? And what is the land that is under it, right? And there's many papers about, universities like Arkansas or Virginia Tech or many of the great public institutions, understanding the settler colonial legacy of this, right?
Decolonizing the university starts with deep privatization and rehabilitation of a public space. The rearrangement of spatial relations Fanon spoke so eloquently about in his first chapter of Les damnés de la terre, it starts with a redefinition of what is public, what pertains to the realm of a commons, and as such does not belong to anyone in particular, because it must be equally shared between equals. Post-colonial landscapes. In this part, we also as we presented to you, the idea of a first collective with Novice, we wanted to extend their strategy, and we created a post-Novice, a collective with many different collaborators from different practices, but also with some of our students, current students or previous students. And the idea was to really think about creating work with the idea of a planetary practice. What does it mean to be a planetary practice today? And how can we address really different conditions, but with a lot of topics that join all of these places. So that's some of the posters we did for this, which we call our propaganda posters from the landscapes of Nebraska to the landscapes of Puerto Rico.
And part of this is questioning the legacy of landscape representation. If we look at the Hudson River School of Painting, that was based on the ideas of Alexander von Humboldt, and this sort of call for sort of Western scientists and painters to discover the global South or the tropics, and how this sort of led to a generation of painters that will violently sort of erase the indigenous communities that live in these landscapes and create some sort of postcards that invite the sort of reappropriation or conquering, right, of the land. These are painting The Last of the Mohicans. And part of this also, we can imagine how John Gast's American Progress, right, like the Manifest Destiny image with the indigenous people getting pushed away into the darkness by the enlightened. If you can see in the arms of these white women, it's a school book, right? That it is through education, right, that these ideas of colonization take place. These people bring in technology and farming and all the things that they think are valuable, and they also think the other people that were there before them don't possess, right? This translated into a series of projects for us in which we thought about Puerto Rico in the future as it is going, where investors and the American government sees the island either as a military playground or as a place where the land is the most valuable asset, where people are completely secondary. So that's why they don't care when we die by the thousands, and start rethinking what is the role, what happens when the people have been pushed out and all that remains is militarized architecture, right? This is an installation, post-colonial room, and a series of images that we hope also we can develop in the workshops in the school that are part of our series of these post-colonial landscapes. Initially showing those paintings by the Hudson River School reoccupied by some of those monuments, sometimes with dismembered effigies of politicians or with militarized architecture. We have been recently working in a play together with some of our members, not only former students, but also collaborators from other departments and writers, poets and fiction writers, like Luis Otoniel Rosa or Hilary Weiss, Rosemary Florian. And these are some of the images of that play that is taking place in the era of COVID. So we are all working remotely in explaining this sort of relationship to the land and to these militarized architectures. Most recently, we did a project during COVID in collaboration with United Nude, in which we were thinking about their forms in their shoes and all that, and our post-colonial narratives, and how to bring the designer not anymore as a background orchestrator, but in the center of this fantastic odyssey, right? So we were able to make a poem in which we are also part of the images. So it is also rethinking the fashion lookbook of during this era, also rethinking collaboration between disciplines, in this case fashion and architecture, but also allowing us to explore the idea of the post-colonial narrative through other mediums. So these are some of the images where we are telling the story, but also we're participating in the construction of these landscapes. And more recently, an exhibition that opened in Venice now, and it's going to be part, like a parallel project that has been happening for 3 years now, of the Unfolding Pavilion, where 12 international studios were invited to do a residency in a building that has been demolished now, and in which we develop our post-colonial room in a former building designed by John Haydock, in a building in an island in Venice, near Venice. And when we got invited to do the last iteration of the MoMA PS1 Young Architects program, we wanted to bring that critique of the fetish, of the tropical fetish and the relationship of all the migrant Puerto Ricans in New York. And we proposed to do the aviary from our post-colonial landscapes in the PS1, instead of doing a playground or some place to have fun, actually to reflect on that history of settler colonialism. And these are some of the exhibitions we have done together with our students and our collaborators, This is the first world making of Post Novis in Omaha in Maple Street Construct. And each one of the students made an architecton and made a narrative, like a critical narrative behind it. We had the opportunity to release a syllabus that was kind of the beginning of Loud Readers, and we're going to talk about Loud Readers soon. We published some books together, and we create a series of events where we will be reading these manifestos and do sort of a lecture series, publications. And this is the last physical lecture we did in Carnegie Mellon in 2019 actually, the fall of 2019, where we turned the stage into a Post Novis installation, where we were trying to recruit also more world makers around the world. And more recently, we had the opportunity to create a free online trade school. After COVID, we realized that a lot of students, they were deprived of an opportunity when many institutions closed all around the world, or they were kind of left hanging without the institutions wanting to take any responsibility. So we try to use whatever media we have, internet, Zoom, YouTube, or whatever, and create a free online trade school where we will invite speakers from all around the world and offer a school where students can enroll for free and they can participate in all these sessions of world making. So it was based on the Tobacco Loud Readers. And we have, up to now, we have over 30-something speakers, literally from South Africa, from China, from the US, Belgium. And we have students enrolled in the trade school from pretty much all around the world too, where we can do all these workshops, 2 to 3 workshops a day for 10 consecutive days. And we have been keeping the Loud Reader sessions once every other week, irregularly, depending on world events. So you can go online and find all the documentation there, download all the books that we have been reading, and follow some of the workshops also online. So all that is available. And we are still developing more programs with this now in different institutions, but always accessible and free. We also, as part of this, we have the opportunity to publish the Anti-Racist Architecture Manifesto in the summer. And these are some of the media covering of the Loud Readers trade school. We also have the opportunity to develop similar platforms and collaborate in different languages, like in Spanish, and even become a loud reader in public space, right? Where during the protests in Pittsburgh by the young Black educated and the Black Lives Matter protests, I have also the opportunity to talk about the relationship of architecture to this anti-Blackness, right, in the city, and all the sort of racist policies and racist mechanisms that are taking place.
Also following the idea of loud readers, that was one of our studios that we did in Carnegie Mellon 1 year ago, where we asked our students to become like a contemporary loud readers and to design a campus for that. So they each developed like a theme, and they developed their own laboratories around the idea of loud reading. And you can see some of the topics. So that's like kind of a collective campus that they designed together.
In a former naval base of the military in Puerto Rico.
In Puerto Rico, and where the outdoor spaces are as activated as the indoor spaces. So for example, that's the laboratory of Taylor Latime, where she was dealing with the idea of Black art and emancipation of Blackness. So that's some picture of the interior, or Christoph Erich with his school for rioting. So what was interesting is like all this happened actually before last summer, and we can see that a lot of topics that the students already came with were like really exploded during the summer events. Or Crystal Shu with criticizing the role of media and digital platform, facial recognition. Or Selena Zen with the idea also of questioning fast fashion and what does it mean to have like a more ethical production of clothes. Or Cassandra Howard with the idea of land reparation and what does it think of program where food is central, with a lot of communal gardens, communal kitchen, and acknowledgement of what food you can produce locally and seasonally. Or Sijen with a critique of the American dream. We have been also developing like a lot of different programs and different types of event exchanges with different publics. So that's some of the workshops we did with kids, where we can like play with the idea of collage or storytelling, also dealing with idea of a city or architecture, or what does it mean to live together. We develop also a series of books for children. So that's like a cover of one, that's a story of a little girl and the sun, but also deals with the idea of criticizing the different aspects of a city and how to question, again, different forms of coming together. Or Palace of Megalith, that was one of our favorite projects that we did in Shenyang with children. And how can we really kind of exchange or engage with different publics in terms of thinking together, what does it mean to create cities? So that's like different construction we did during the days where we worked together. So we had like a lot of different age groups, and we could ask a lot of different aspects about architecture and the city. Part 3, hardcore forms and media, 2008. The limits of my language means the limit of my world.
And for this is really interesting. And I show this image, right? Because recently with all the Black Lives Matter and the universities trying to sort of question the curriculum and what's the role of form in all of this. I show this to show that no, Europeans didn't invent form, right? And they didn't invent language either, right? Because it becomes to that point where we had to kind of say that. And I love that they found this, like 200 BC, somebody drew a cat, in a mountain in Nazca in Peru. And it's also that we're really interested in the role of media and form making, not as a settler colonial project, but as an emancipating project. So understanding the relationships between our struggles and historical struggles that use form, right? The powerful knows how to use form. So we have to know how to use form too in order to challenge them. And you can see here from the Wipala flag of the Andean sort of indigenous groups to sort of avant-garde anarchist groups to tropical anarchist groups. All the relationships are there, and that's really important for us as we generate many different publications and many different platforms to express these ideas. These are some of our books, from the Post-Novis one to our independent magazines to our most recent books. The exhibitions we have curated that initially have been sort of self-initiated to more institutional ones, like the ones in the Chicago Biennale in 2015, or our most recent book on narrative architecture that deals also how to use the role of image to critique that sort of European modernist legacy. So that's also a book that is engaging with that, or even our collages that are trying to understand the role of utopian thinking and architecture, right? For the good and for the bad, not only for the good or for the bad. This is our most recent mural of 120 ideal cities that was shown in the newest museum in Nuremberg in 2020, in the summer of 2020. Somehow during COVID, they still managed to put the exhibition up. And other books that, as I said, deal with the idea of form and trying to understand how can we understand the role of form and the ideology behind form and use it and question it. These are some of the collages we created for our book on pure hardcore icons. In the Chinese version that it should be out this year, we're looking forward. It has extended articles and interviews. The exhibition we made in 2014 on the topic. It got translated in 2014 by Arch Plus into German. It sounds pretty cool in German too, hardcore architecture. The exhibition we did in Berlin based on it. And even when we're trying to make pavilions for children, also working with the same ideas. This in Beijing, our book, Shape Island Text, trying to understand a universalist vocabulary based on that idea of forms. This book we published in Sevilla, 2015, where some of those concrete poems become real at different scales. That's
installation and exhibitions we did either in our apartment in Beijing or in different gallery spaces or museum. Part 4, platform, spaces for pedagogy. Since each of us was several, we were already quite a crowd.
And this is the last part of the lecture, and we wanted to show you some projects to see also how these ideas relate when we're trying to make buildings or platforms that sometimes they take different forms. In 2014, we were selected as one of the 10 finalists to design the biggest museum in Russia. So we went to Beijing, to Moscow twice, and it was a really important experience for us because we were competing against studios that were much bigger and famous, right? And it showed that we could use our skills somehow to find a space in architecture without compromising too much. We proposed to do a museum that was open for the people, where you don't have to pay to participate in the exhibitions. So we proposed to put all the main galleries where you have to pay above in these bridges, and then keep all the public spaces down, where you create a promenade where people are circulating to the building. At the end, we didn't end up winning. They chose a building that was a tower because the client wanted something vertical. It was too expensive. They scratched the project. It didn't happen. But with our broken hearts, when we returned to Beijing, we took the idea, and with no money and whatever, we decided to open a space in the center of Beijing, away from the galleries in the periphery, where we will bring, maybe for the first time in the country, truly global exhibitions where we will show artists from all around the world, not based on a market. So it was all based on the idea of the free exchange of knowledge and the construction of critical positions. And we run around 70 exhibitions from over 200 artists from all around the world, except from Antarctica, from every continent except Antarctica, because we couldn't find artists from Antarctica. At the beginning, we were running in our space, but eventually we will get invited to larger institutions like museums and art centers to keep on running the program. This became really fundamental for us, and you can see the relationship between this and Loud Readers, right? As he also created some form of alternative pedagogy, alternative space for discourse, and it allows us also to collaborate with other institutions to keep on asking the same questions, right? So these are some of the exhibitions we designed and curated in different museums in China. Here you can see a work by Jason Mena, who's based in Mexico City, and below Yu Bogong, that is an artist from Mongolia, from Inner Mongolia. And what you see there, it says "The dream is over," written in the stone, carved in the stone. It's an exhibition about language, or exhibition about the history of materialism, with a Fala Atelier here from Portugal, or Christopher Ray Perez, that is a poet from Texas, or Yuan Qi, that is a filmmaker from China, right? So that allow us to create these truly global exhibitions. This photo from Lena Sivitsova from Russia. And then we were invited by a developer in China to do a project where we can turn another sort of courtyard house into a gallery, which we propose that is only possible to do this if we provide some services to the people that are already living there, because they didn't have access to toilets, so they had to go to the public toilets. So we proposed to use funding to create facilities for them. We did an exhibition called Utopia Room in one of the spaces to show that it was possible to run it. At the end, we proposed the project. The developer didn't want to put money into the neighbors, and we declined the project. So at the end, it didn't happen because they just wanted to do the gallery. And then
that's like one project we did when we were teaching at the School of Architecture at Taliesin, which was in the town, a small former mining town called Miami
in Arizona.
Where with our first year students, we were asked by the community to change a former school into like affordable housing for teachers, to try to kind of revitalize the town. So we had to deal with an existing building. So we went and documented, and what was good is that we could have a lot of exchange with the community, either doing workshop with high schoolers from there, or also different kinds of public, because there was also like a very high demand on creating communal and collective programs that could also serve for the city. So we went, measured the school, and proposed these designs. The students proposed this design. So that's like the new project that they did. So the idea was like to free the first ground and to have a lot of communal programs there. And they each created different types of units with different themes. So if it's also like the idea of questioning also how people live and accessibility for all of us. Creating, like, for example, like a basketball court above the parking lot to be accessible for everybody from the city, from a small town, or also like changing the building at the back that was like a former gymnasium into like a communal center for different types of events, exhibition. So at the end, we had the opportunity to present the project directly in the school, so in the building that was going to be transformed, and to exchange and discuss with the community there. So some pictures of different models and different skills that we could, with what we can test the design. And the day where we opened the exhibition and presented the project to the community.
The idea was that the project Gensler offered to run it pro bono. So hopefully at some point it will happen. It was strange because also we're teaching students for the first time representation and drawing. None of them had architecture background, but also we're doing a real project in a real community. So it was a kind of challenging condition, and the community was really happy with it. And the last project we're gonna show today is a project that we did in collaboration with a business professor, the director of the International Business Program in the University of Nebraska and Lincoln. He's originally, he has connections to Nigeria. He's from Nigeria. And the idea was that he wanted to create a school that was gonna be both in Nebraska and in Africa, where students will be traveling, and it will be a boarding school where students will learn through art and farming. The school should be able to grow and shrink depending on the conditions. And we propose this series of world-making spaces that all of them have access to a garden. So students can learn through farming and art. So at the end, it was this cluster of buildings. In the left, you can see sort of the dormitories for the boarding school, and everything else, these world-making spaces, some pictures of the models and the school.
The idea was also like to propose a design that could adapt to different sites and also different stages in the development of a project. So as well, like it's thought as units that could be easily assembled, added, or removed. And again, like what we found really interesting is like this questioning of pedagogy and how can farming, agriculture, and relationship to your land, as well as to the arts and culture, can really kind of reinforce the education system.
And that is all for today. So we'll be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Natalia and Cruz. Thank you. I'll do a real clapping, but I'm sure that there is virtual clapping happening elsewhere. We do have already 3 questions here in the Q&A, and I'm going to be joined by a student of landscape architecture in our school, Keida Fisher, who is also going to read with me those questions here in the chat. But before that, before starting with the questions, I wanted to ask if you could speak briefly about the workshops that you proposed for the school.
So we're planning to do one like a week-long workshop and a shorter one that is more based on diagrams. But the first one deals a lot with the part of the post-colonial landscapes we show, in which we hope to ask questions. First, explain what a post-colonial landscape is for us, and what a post-colonial narrative is, and then ask questions to see how do the students can subvert their environment and re-question the institutions around them, or even the images of the places where they come from and that they see. I think that's a really important part of being able to make new worlds is to be able to decode what's problematic in the ones we have. And so there's gonna be a part of, basic technique, composition and stuff like that, but also about the content, how can we storytell through these really difficult questions, through humor and irony and storytelling. And then the other one, it's related to the Manual of Anti-Racist Architecture Education. And we're looking also forward the students to let us know what do they find problematic in education, right? And how they see how can it change, right? In the sense that we made diagrams that are trying to find what are the things that need to be updated and so on. But I feel like there's so many perspectives and ways to see how the world should be, that being able to articulate that through drawings and perhaps we want to generate a collective publication to see what are all these different perspectives, not only right from one discipline in architecture, but rather bringing interior, landscape, bringing what are the things that you feel must change in order for us to have truly critical and inclusive and truly welcoming and world transforming platforms of education and representation.
Thank you.
The first question we have is from Charles McKinney. So they ask, what would be an appropriate thing for colleges to do in relation to high tuition costs versus lower family income, and to make architecture school attractive to displaced and disadvantaged people?
Could you repeat the beginning again?
Yes. What would be an appropriate thing for colleges to do in relation to high tuition costs versus lower family income?
So this is really, for me, it's a really easy question. I don't know if the institutions are willing to do it, but institutions like Arkansas, like, pretty much every land-grant university in the country has to be free. That's the first thing. It is not an innovative thing, like pretty much all the rest of the developed world and non-developed world, third world countries, they have free education. It's accessible, right? So having all this crazy tuition cost, it is impossible to have an equitable, if you want to use that term, right? That is kind of financial term. It's impossible, right? The median household income of Black, Indigenous, Latino families, Asian families in some places, it's not even near the fraction of the cost of studying, right? The scholarship is a myth, right? As we showed, and that was a study written by one of the leading scholarship experts in the country. It is not a coincidence that at the time that Black people and women could finally enroll in university, the tuition started to rise a lot, right? It is not a coincidence. And if the people that are in control of the universities are not willing to do this, of course, policymakers, are really at the center of this, because they will put money in everything except in free education and free health. There are two fundamental things. If that doesn't change, nothing is going to change. It's just going to be symbolic, right? It's just going to be, a few Black and brown students, right, for the pictures. They're going to be great. They're going to do great things, but there's not going to be a real systemic change because we are still excluding the majority of the people, right? And it's not a question of majority and minority, because it's still happening in South Africa, the same thing, in a country that is majority Black, the power is still controlled by white people in the institutions, right? So if Angela Davis says something that I completely agree. She says public education of quality will be a form of reparation that benefit everybody, right? And part of the idea of the postcolony is that we're arguing that whatever forms of oppression happen in the plantation, it affects everybody today, right? Like, you could be a white student from rural US and still be oppressed completely by this, right? Like, have no access to education. So it's not just affecting Black and brown communities. It is just all over the place, right? So that's fundamental. That has to change. And then there are other things that the schools can do meanwhile, right? Like, you need to provide accessible education. Use the money from endowments. I don't know, like, there needs to be a relocation of resources that allows for people to study without getting indebted. That this is just fundamental, right? There's no way where we can take decisions that are beneficial for us if we are thinking about how we're gonna pay this ridiculous amount of debt we have. it is impossible, right? And also we have to be honest with you, none of us have student debt. We both study for free. And that's really fundamental for us. Like Natalie studied for free in France because the universities are free. And I studied for free in Puerto Rico when the university was much cheaper and because I was a runner, right? So I get all the track scholarships or whatever. So it shouldn't be like that, right? It should be like everybody has access to it. And the money is there in society, right? It's just not allocated appropriately. So if we don't address those questions, I don't know how we're gonna improve the situation.
I think it's a very important question, and I think that it demands like two different approaches to it. One approach is very how do you say, like direct, in a way that we really need to find specific solutions to that, to address like real accessibility because of rising costs of education. But I think also fundamentally we need as society to rethink what education means and what education means within for ourselves, right? Because you would think that a healthy society should think that education is at the core of its values, which means that it should be of quality, but it should be access shouldn't be a question at any point during, like, from kindergarten to college. To college education. So I think there's a lot to do for that. But of course, there's different skills to approach that, and different actors that play a role in that. So I think we should still keep the conversation going, because it's something that needs to move on, right? Because the problem is, like, as we know it, it's difficult to go back once the system really goes in a way that everything increases, the prices increases, and everything is set in a way that it becomes kind of a normal, right? But again, like, we all hope that, and maybe that's the year where we can bring all this to the
and that also will help change, because having people coming in the institutions, right, will generate different types of professors, right, and different types of knowledge, and that's what's really needed. While that's not happening, it's impossible that we actually make real change. We can make smaller gestures, right? But it's not really gonna change. It's not gonna tilt. It's not gonna tilt the world, right? So we really need to. I feel like young people are the future, so they have really that in their hands. If they demand it, at some point it will change, right? Like, at least when they get to power, or they can take different forms of decisions.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions. I don't know if we're going to have time to go through all 3, but the second one by an anonymous attendee. Your work uses some of the current tools of architectural practice, which include image making using design-oriented software. How do you think about the foundation of architectural practice in pervasive paid software that could be cost prohibitive or limited by access to specialized training? These softwares are an industry that hooks students in schools and follows them into practice, and can limit or discourage activity outside of their standard use toward money-making ends.
I mean, I think that's a question that is almost like it's the second wing of the same bird of the first question, because it is still like accessibility, right, and costs. It is real. I think that there are options of things. There are like open source software that usually is not so popular, and we actually don't use it. We also part of the institutions, unfortunately. I think that there's ways around it, but we know the prices of Autodesk and all that. So I think really asking critical questions would imply that we will need to create different type of accessible software. I think it's all part of the same thing. When you leave people study for free, they stop seeing the world as a business, right? But what happens is, like, when we treat education as a business, everybody is trying to hustle everybody out of the business, right? So the architects that design software, they're thinking about how they can make money, right? And I feel like it's all somehow part of the same problem. So that needs to change too, right? It is, even for us, when we do loud readers, it is problematic because even the computers, who has access to a computer? COVID has exposed how cruel and unfair are the disparities, where some people cannot even connect online, right? Because they have no internet, if they have a computer, and all of a sudden we are all forced to be there. So from the internet, I wouldn't even go to the software, starting with the internet and the accessibility to computers is already a problem, right? So we need to really rethink that through different economic models. And of course, somebody will say, oh, that's not really an architectural question, but because it relates to architecture, it's still architectural, right? But these are truly legitimate questions that need to be addressed in a really, really large scale. And we need to think about them. And I think that they make great prompts to wondering about how to solve these issues, through infrastructure, through, it's not everything about self-driving cars, which I think is still like sort of a private property type of question. But I see many projects about self-driving cars, but not so many projects about free and accessible internet, right? And computers. So maybe we have to switch what are we thinking about?
I think it also raises the question of what work do we value and why, and what works we produce that we value and why. And again, it goes back to what Cruz was saying when he was speaking of seeing education as a business. And I think that's a problem too, because then we think that what comes out of education, how we practice in education, is always has a certain value attached to a redefined format of production. And especially in architecture, when at some point it was like a really like high fashion to have like very realistic kind of renders or video software. And you would again, going back to the question of content versus form, like I think that's also something that we tend to lose track when we think of education, and maybe especially education in architecture, is content first, right? What does it mean to really, there's many ways to produce architecture, there's many tools that we can use. And again, like it goes hand in hand with the first question, is the problem of justifying the use of certain things, that are more linked to business, and that becomes the only thing that is seen in internet, in different platforms, or that is valued as the proper production of architecture. So I hope that we showed you, we had a lot to show tonight. So I think we already had a lot of slides, but that's also something that really interest us always, is what kind of tools and what kind of mediums can we use that kind of challenges that. And thinking architecture, I think we are lucky to be in a profession where we can really extend our our imagination and imaginary when it comes to that. And when we look at the history of the production of architecture, we can think of handmade collages, we can think of models, we can think of different materials, we can think of paintings. There's so many different rich ways to approach architecture that shouldn't depend on, really expensive softwares.
Thank you. This is the last question, fortunately, that we can take today. It's from Adam Duff. What can I do as a student to help my school become more inclusive and encourage diversity?
Oof. Demand, just like organize. I think like a lot of students are, again, as I saw in Pittsburgh, high schoolers leading all the protests. I feel students are really leading the charge. I would say don't take your foot out of the pedal and demand more. And if you don't see change, just keep on asking for it, right? Like, here in our institution, we have a lot of problems and students are kind of not letting it go. So we cannot afford, I feel like we are in a really historical moment. If we don't take advantage now, it's not gonna happen. I don't see how can you force people to see reality when reality is so bluntly manifested, right? So if we really understand in history, where are we situated? We need to treat it with urgency, right? And I also tell to the students all the time, and I said that when I was in the streets of Pittsburgh, I said, like, you have the power. There's no university without you. This is real. I mean, university without students is not a university. It's just buildings and books, right? There's no teachers without students, right? And you have to understand that, right? And if we really want to make a change, we need to make things differently, because we've been doing the same thing for a long time and it hasn't worked out, right? Like from ecology to our problems that we're seeing manifested. So ask for it and make it happen, right? Like we need change, and we need you to demand that change, and we need you to be at the forefront, right, of demanding it. You know, when somebody's giving you a syllabus that is the same thing that has been taught for 100 years and is not willing to change, you know, we can question that, right? Like we need to figure out ways that we are not rendered invisible from the narratives that we're being told, which is often the case, right? And I feel like a lot of you have been doing that, and we need to understand that that's fundamentally central to what we do, right? Design, and it doesn't mean that it's gonna kill creativity. On the other hand, right? Like that's gonna an amazing opportunity for creativity, an amazing opportunity to use the tools and the vehicles we have to control and to generate new narratives, right? Like new ways of telling stories and new ways to bring the people to the center of those stories.
And even if some people don't want to acknowledge it, the world is changing and we are all moving forward. So I think it's a motivation to really keep the discussion going and really, like as Cruz mentioned, like go front with your demand and ask for change, because now is the moment.
Thank you. Peter, Brian?
Yeah, I want to thank Natalie and Cruz again. I think you've seen the gratitude and the appreciation in the chat column. At least I hope you do, from a wide range of our audience. And besides the applause that you're receiving, I think I also simply want to second your calls for the urgency of the moment and to recognize that. I think it's possible, in fact, to understand that urgency whether you're a student or whether you're a faculty member or whether you're a staff member or whether you are in a position of supposed power such as a dean or an administrator. It's a collective effort, absolutely. And I think we've been very fortunate that you have been able to arrive into our discussions. And I know we now are going to look forward to the workshops over the next 2 weeks and to the report coming, in a sense, on February 8th. I'll look forward to that and hearing more about that from Gabriella and others. We have I think, an extremely active group of faculty and staff and students who, as you've just seen from our student questions, are deeply concerned. And that is certainly heard. And we are addressing this to all the extent that we can. It's never going to be enough. That's the thing to understand too, right? It's always going to be insufficient. And yet, in that sense, we also must continue to work and be forward thinking in this. So again, I want to thank you for the continued challenge and the continued inspiration. And again, we'll look forward to your work. I want to remind everyone, maybe it's the obvious, that we head towards February, which has been designated for some years now as Black History Month. But one could say that every month is Black History Month, right? And this is where we must be that conscious of the labeling of people, the labeling of dates, the labeling of time periods. I'm quite sure this is what Cruz and Natalie are going to work with our students on as well. It's vital to begin to change our definitions of things. And I take that very seriously as well. And again, I'll look forward to the work of the workshop as helping us continue to take our steps forward. So
I also wanted to say, if there is any questions that somebody forgot to ask, you can write them down and send them to Gabriel, and maybe he can send it to us, and we will be happy to reply to you by email or anything.
One other thing to say is that if you are interested on joining the workshop, please, as I wrote in the chat box at the beginning of today's lecture, we are waiting for your emails to try to have you admitted into the workshop.
all right. Again, thanks so much. We'll see you
Thank
soon
you very
enough.
much.
Be well. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
To be continued with the workshops next week.
Everyone.
Looking
Thank you,
forward.
Natalie and
Looking
Cruz.
forward.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.